Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Pavlina Cherneva. I am the president of the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event. This is not going to be a regular academic lecture. This is our community gathering to champion a vital idea, that truth and rigorous analysis matter, that our ability to solve problems and find common ground depends on a shared commitment to facts and honest inquiry. We are also here to provide a forum and learn from one of our own, a distinguished Bard College alumna and dedicated public servant whose career has been defined by a commitment to curating good data as the foundation of sound policy. We are incredibly proud to welcome home Dr. Erika McEntarfer. Erika is an accomplished labor economist who until recently served as commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, appointed by President Biden. Prior to that appointment, she dedicated over 20 years to non-political roles across the federal government, serving the American public under multiple administrations. She was a lead labor market economist in the Census Bureau's Center for Economic Studies. She served on the economic staff of the Treasury Department's Office of Tax Policy, and prior to her appointment at the BLS, had been on the non-political staff of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. As you know, last month, she was dismissed by President Trump following the release of the BLS's official jobs report, which showed a weakening economy, a weakening jobs market, data which contradicted the administration's preferred narrative. Tonight, she will tell us her side of the story. I'm incredibly humbled and honored that Erika accepted my invitation and chose her alma mater to make her first public appearance since that day. As I have shared with some of you before, BLS, some of us at the Levy Institute and the Economics Department use BLS data daily. And I personally have been struck with how responsive statisticians are to the needs of researchers. I mean, you can literally pick up the phone and you can call them and you can find out how the data is measured, what is the methodology, and if there's some quirk, if there's something unusual in that particular month that might be giving some unusual results. Now, the BLS itself has ongoing projects to improve and develop their own data. For example, we at the Levy Economics Institute had also contributed to a BLS commissioned study on strengthening the consumer expenditure survey. And you can find that work on the BLS website. You can also find it on our website, levy.org. The Levy Economics Institute is also the home of two graduate programs, one Master of Science, 1 year Master of Science, and a 2-year Master, a 1-year Master of Arts and a 2-year Master of Science in Economic Theory and Policy. Now, our scholars and our students study policies that improve employment, that promote good jobs for all, higher incomes, and greater economic and financial stability. And our work is rooted in a simple credo. Start with facts, not ideology, and build models from the real-world economic experiences of people, all of which is only possible with access to reliable and trustworthy data. The Bureau of Labor Statistics provides the essential metrics. They give us metrics on jobs, on wages, on prices, on inflation, all of the things that impact the pocketbooks of American families. Metrics that allow us to measure their economic well-being. And in a recent Levy Institute policy brief, my colleague Randall Ray and I demonstrated that economic status is the single strongest factor explaining long-term shifts in party allegiance among Americans. So I'll leave you with this final thought. Understanding how the fortunes of working people are changing and how they might be improved is essential. and it is only possible with a trusted statistical foundation. So if political actors threaten this foundation, and the data is politicized or obscured, we would be left with little more than competing ideologies. We would lose our capacity to truly understand the economic forces shaping our communities and our country. And this is what is ultimately at stake here, the principle of an informed democracy itself. I'm truly delighted to welcome a Bard College leader and public servant, Dr. Erika McEntarfer.
So August 1st was like any other first Friday of the month. When the jobs numbers come out and my quiet and usually obscure little corner of the government goes about its business of telling political leaders what these data tell us about the state of the economy. Except by the end of that day, I had been very publicly fired by the President of the United States and was on my way to becoming a household name. It was quite a day, to say the least. But I'll start from the beginning. At 8 in the morning, before the numbers were out, we briefed the Labor Secretary and her team on the data. The White House, they actually get the numbers the day before the release, so we had done a similar briefing for them the previous afternoon. So the big news in this particular release was that the pace of jobs growth had recently slowed. Firms that had responded late to the business survey had now submitted their data, and those late submissions had changed the picture of jobs growth for June and for May, which now looked much more anemic than previously thought. So I explained to the Secretary that this negative skew in jobs growth among the late reporting firms, it was an unusual event, but it wasn't an unprecedented one. It typically occurs when the labor market slows suddenly, such as the start of a recession. Changes to immigration policy, tariff uncertainty had likely put downward pressure on hiring this past spring, slowing the pace of jobs growth. This didn't necessarily mean that the economy was entering a recession now. Other data, such as the unemployment rate, was holding steady. So the faces around the room were pretty glum. Let's face it, this isn't the kind of news that any administration really wants to hear. I asked if anyone had any questions on the revisions before we moved on to the July data. There were none, so we moved on. After the briefing, I traveled back to headquarters, and then around 2 p.m., I got an email from a reporter asking me to comment on a tweet from the president that I would be fired for the jobs report. So trust me, in 23 years of working in the federal government, I had never gotten such an email before. And to be honest, I didn't think I'd really been fired. I mean, the president had been threatening to fire Jay Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, for months and hadn't followed through. And it wasn't the first time Trump had accused the Bureau of Labor Statistics of cooking the books. I thought it was an angry tweet. Because firing your chief statistician is a dangerous step. That's an attack on the independence of an institution, arguably as important as the Federal Reserve for economic stability. It has serious economic consequences. That they would do this with no warning, it made no sense. And that's when I noticed another email in my inbox, which was dated 20 minutes prior to the email from the reporter. And it was a short note from the Presidential Personnel Office. Dr. McEntarfer, on behalf of President Donald J. Trump, I am writing to inform you that your position as Commissioner of Labor Statistics is terminated, effective immediately. Thank you for your service. That is about the moment that my phone exploded. CNN, NBC, ABC, CBS. My mother called to let me know George Stephanopoulos called her trying to reach me. My brother, my stepsisters, my favorite aunt, friends, former colleagues, all texting. They'd all just looked at the news. It was pretty wild. I had always been careful not to bore my very tolerant family and friends by talking too much about my extremely wonky job. And now all of a sudden, the whole world was talking about it. My guess is that's when most of you here became aware that a BART alum was in charge of the nation's labor and inflation statistics. Most likely, you had no idea such a position even existed. I have traveled all over the country in that role, and I can tell you many, many people have never heard of the Bureau of Labor Statistics or know that it has a Senate-confirmed commissioner. And that's really how it should be. You should get to live in a country where you do not have to know who the chief statisticians are and worry if they are okay. But here we are. So let me take a moment to explain why the work of the Bureau of Labor Statistics is actually really important and in fact touches every one of you in ways that you may not realize. The agency's data on employment, unemployment, and inflation are front page news at least twice a month. The trajectory of that data informs the decisions of policymakers at the Federal Reserve and the White House, as well as millions of businesses who closely track economic conditions to inform their own decisions. So while the jobs report features most prominently in people's sense of what the agency does, its price programs arguably have a more direct impact on the lives of most Americans. These data determine the cost of living increases for millions of senior citizens on Social Security and pay increases for workers who are on contracts. If you rent an apartment, that data impacts what your rent increase is going to be next year. If you have a mortgage, it helps determine your mortgage interest rate. They're also the most closely watched data by the Federal Reserve for setting monetary policy. And it's this data that will help us understand who's paying the costs of the recently enacted tariffs: foreign producers, domestic businesses, or us. There are also indirect ways that this data affect you. A useful analogy is to think of the US economy like a city's transportation infrastructure. Just like traffic sensors, cameras, and GPS data help city planners understand where congestion, road usage, and repairs are needed, economic data helps policymakers, businesses, and investors understand where the economy is thriving, slowing, or in need of intervention. Real-time economic data is like live traffic updates. It's helpful for making quick decisions, like adjusting interest rates quickly to avoid an economic downturn. The city planners of the US economy, the senior officials at the Federal Reserve, President's senior economic advisors, they watch this data very closely. So do the traders on Wall Street, investment banks, and business economists. The decisions that they make to adjust interest rates to avoid a recession, to build a new plant in your city, to sell stocks or bonds, those decisions impact how easy it's going to be for you to find a good job, how affordable it will be for you to buy a house and raise a family, and how comfortable your retirement's going to be. Messing with economic data is like messing with the traffic lights and turning those sensors off. Cars don't know where to go. Traffic backs up at intersections. There are more accidents. The city planners no longer have data to reroute traffic, and everybody's unhappy, scared, and worse off. The reason my firing was big news is because nobody thinks it's going to be good for our economy if we start messing with those traffic lights. So when Pavlina invited me here to speak today, she said a lot of people in the BARD community were curious to know more about me and how I got from BARD to running a federal agency. So I didn't actually start out at BARD planning to become an economist. And I actually took my first economics course in this very building. That economics course changed my life. It gave me tools to understand things about the world that had really puzzled me. So I grew up in a Rust Belt town in upstate New York in the 70s and 80s. The community that I was raised in was struggling to make its way economically as the steel mills and other manufacturing jobs had disappeared. Poverty was very high and jobs were very scarce. I honestly didn't realize until I got to BARD how much economic disparity exists in this country. That some regions of the country were prospering and gaining wealth right alongside places that were struggling. So I initially thought economics had something to do with the stock market. Instead, I found this discipline that was focused on questions of prosperity, economic growth, and inequality. So I was sold. I decided that I would become an economist. So like most people who go to grad school, I thought at first I was going to become a college professor, like my professors here at BARD. Instead, when I was on the job market, I interviewed with this fascinating startup research lab at the Census Bureau. I'm pretty sure my advisor thought I was crazy to turn down an academic job to go work at Census, but I loved working with data, and the Census group was really smart and fun to be around. I wanted to do what they were doing. So what that team was working on was leveraging recent advances in computing power, so this is like the early aughts, to allow government administrative data to be used in federal statistics. The basic idea was to make government more efficient by better leveraging the data assets it already had. Better data makes for better decision making, and it was really gratifying to see our data being used around the country for economic development planning, for disaster response, to help recent veterans find jobs. Our work impacted everything from how to detour traffic around a bridge collapse to helping college counselors guide students' career paths and major choices. So I landed in public service sort of by accident. I was drawn to a particular group and the work that they were doing. But as the years went by, I found that mission, putting data in the hands of people who can use it to improve their communities and make their lives better, more and more gratifying. If you want to leave the world a better place than you found it, one path to doing so is serving the American people and trying to make life here better for everyone in big ways and small. It's extremely rewarding work. So how did I get from there to heading the Bureau of Labor Statistics? So it was the tail end of the pandemic. I was still at Census, and like many others, I'd been working remotely for 2 years. I was bored. I was bored with Teams meetings and virtual conferences, and I really wanted to get out of my house. That's when I heard a friend of mine, a colleague, was searching for someone to replace him on a detail to the White House Council of Economic Advisors as a senior economic advisor. So a little bit about the council. The Council of Economic Advisors has been around since 1947. It was set up to be a sort of economic think tank within the White House. Its role is to advise the president and senior White House officials on economic research, policy, and the state of the economy. Its mission is to really supply objective and nonpartisan advice and perspectives. The chair is usually an academic on detail from a university. The senior staff are drawn from academia, but also the Federal Reserve and, like myself, other government agencies. There's also a ton of young people in the White House. The junior staff were largely PhD students, new college grads thinking about careers in public policy or in economics. And we had experts on every subject imaginable, oil markets, international finance, climate, education, healthcare, trade, more. And I was brought on to be the senior labor economist. So I arrived in the White House in the summer of '22. Inflation had just peaked, and the labor market was still struggling to recover from the pandemic. I spent a lot of time at the White House poring over data, trying to determine if the labor market recovery from the pandemic was stalling out. The Federal Reserve was hiking rates to stave off inflation, tech firms were laying off workers, and economic sentiment was grim. The New York Times and every paper in the country was predicting a recession. And every month, we got new data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we would study it for signs that the recession was imminent. But instead, the recession never came. Instead, slowly and then quickly, the labor market recovered. Jobs Day was a big deal at the Council of Economic Advisors, and we had a lot of fun. It was exciting to learn about the data the day before the world did. I would huddle with the other economists to pick apart the data, looking for patterns and insights and trying to make sense of this bucket of information we just received. We ate way too much chocolate and pizza and stayed up way too late wordsmithing the blog that CEA would put out in the morning after the release. Ultimately, our job was to give the president a narrative that he could use to inform the American public and really the world about what was happening in the US economy. So while I was at the council, the previous BLS commissioner's term expired. And I was asked to put my name in the hat for nomination for his replacement. I did not really think anything would come of it. I was flattered just to be asked. But I was chosen to be the nominee. And then after being chosen to be the nominee, I still had to get through Senate confirmation, which can be a tall order. Many nominees are never confirmed, particularly at the sub-cabinet level. But it actually went very smoothly. The senators that I spoke with considered my experience working in the statistical agencies an asset. My career had spanned multiple administrations. I was known among officials of both parties as a nonpartisan government economist from my work on various committees. So I was actually confirmed faster than any BLS nominee in recent history with an 86-8 vote, with 38 Republican senators voting yes. That's a pretty rare vote in these partisan times. So I arrived at the Bureau of Labor Statistics in January of '24, and I came prepared to help the agency modernize data collection, similar to the work that I had been doing at Census. But this takes money, and what I found out when I got there was Congress was not really into funding that work. So my first job was to figure out how to change that. I didn't have much time, almost none, as it turned out. I managed to get more funding for the labor force survey that underlies the unemployment rate. But then the election happened, and then Elon Musk's Doge happened. I went from having big picture dreams of reforming the agency to being on the defense pretty quickly. It would take much too long to tell you what we went through when Doge blew through the federal government. We navigated more crises in a week than you see in a year in normal times. And keeping the agency operational was a constant high-wire act. Ironically, my last weeks at work were some of the most hopeful I'd had in a while. Elon Musk and Donald Trump had fallen out. Doge's influence was waning. And we had a chance to start reversing some of the damages we had sustained. Maybe we'll return to some sense of normalcy, I hopefully said to another senior leader. 2 weeks later, I was fired. So I hope my remarks today make clear how much I loved being a public servant and how much I admire the work of other government economists, and particularly those I had the honor to work alongside with at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I've devoted my entire career to empowering people to make better policy choices with solid and reliable data. There's no more impactful place to do that than at BLS. And I sincerely wish my time there had not been cut short. I think we're all concerned now about the future of our country's economic data. I have been concerned for a while that our nation's leaders do not appreciate how important good data is to the functioning of this economy. Until the events of the last few weeks, I would have told you my biggest concern was funding and the increasingly challenging environment for data collection. Much of our official data, it depends on surveys, and survey response rates are down here in the US and around the world. This is a global phenomenon. Businesses and households are just harder to reach, and there's a decline in the willingness to participate in surveys. A real problem is that surveys costs are escalating and the budgets are not keeping a pace with those costs. So the BLS budget for data collection had declined 18% in real terms in the 15 years before I showed up at the agency. Its requests for modernization funds are rarely approved. Funding and staffing were in a precarious place even before DOGE blew into town. And staffing at the agency is now down an additional 20% since the start of the year. DOGE cut many of their efforts to modernize data releases, IT infrastructure, and software. But after the events of the last 6 weeks, I'm afraid we have to fear for the independence of the agencies themselves. Economic data must be free from partisan influence. That is essential to the mission of the agency. Markets have to trust that the data are not manipulated. Firing your chief statisticians for releasing data you do not like, it has serious economic consequences. The lists of countries that have gone down this route, it's not a good list. Argentina, Greece, Turkey. The resulting loss of trust in economic statistics led these countries to worsening economic crises, higher inflation, and higher borrowing costs. If we follow a similar path, all Americans will suffer the consequences. We are all here exposed to the higher prices and increased economic instability that result when a nation manipulates its economic data. So what happens now? I can vouch for the accuracy and independence of the work of the agency up until the moment I was fired. I can also say that I worked alongside the current acting commissioner for 18 months, and he is one of the finest public servants I have ever worked with, and he is widely esteemed within the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But in terms of the future, it's a very uncertain moment. I do know that those still within the agency have not stopped working on behalf of the American public. Last week, the BLS staff released their own statement to the media, anonymously, which is the only way they can speak right now. Their words are inspirational. I would like to close my remarks today by reading part of their statement to you. The Bureau of Labor Statistics must remain above politics. Our job is to deliver economic data guided by law and statistical practice, not partisan whim. That's why the firing of Commissioner Erika McEntarfer is so alarming. Dr. McEntarfer did nothing wrong. No serious observer claims otherwise. Commissioners do not cook the numbers. They don't even see them until after the estimates are complete. The real goal is clear: to discredit independent statistics, slash budgets, and bully federal workers into silence. But BLS staff will not be intimidated. We will publish reliable data no matter how inconvenient the results. The numbers will remain accurate and nonpartisan. And if that ever changes, the professionals will tell you. Thank you so much for having me out here today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Hang on. I'm supposed to take this. Thank you so much, Erika. Thank you for being here today, for choosing your alma mater to tell your story. But also thank you for reminding us really what's at stake here. And that's empowering people, empowering those who serve in the public interest to make good policy. So there's been, as you can imagine, a lot of interest in this talk. We've received a lot of questions. We figured the format for the evening will be the following. We will kick things off with a discussion. I'll start filtering through some of the questions, and afterwards we're going to open it for discussion and Q&A from the audience. So let me start off by taking you back to the fateful day. You said that there were a lot of grim faces when they heard the data the night before, but when you went home, did you have any indication that a storm was brewing, that this might lead to a bigger fallout?
So I assume you mean when we briefed the White House the previous
yes.
day? Yeah. So honestly, no. I did not get a sense from our briefing at the White House the night before I was fired. It's the afternoon, really. It's a 2 p.m. briefing, that there was really anything wrong. So we did our usual 2 p.m. Thursday briefing with the numbers with the Council of Economic Advisors. The revisions were on the large side, so we spent some time going through the revisions. I walked them through the reason before the big negative revision for June and for May, which was principally that usually when those late firms respond to the survey, some of them are growing and some of them are shrinking. So they tend to be small movements that cancel each other out, so the data doesn't move very much. But what had happened in this particular month was those positives were missing. So we were getting revisions about the same size, but they were all skewing negative. And we explained this is unusual, but it's happened before. It usually happens when the economy slows. So they asked 2 questions. They asked, when was the last time this happened? And was the skew disproportionately among small employers? The answer to the first question was the early months of the pandemic. And the answer to the second question was no. It was a pretty broad-based negative skew. But these are really normal questions that economists ask when they're trying to figure out what's going on with the data. They're honestly very representative of the kinds of questions I ask when I get my briefings. So it didn't signal anything unusual. You know, it was disappointing news for sure, but I've delivered plenty of bad news jobs reports in my time. It's part of the job.
No, so no indication, and it's very interesting because the revisions and the reporting delay has dominated the news. You know, most people, to the extent that they have heard about issues with the data, they basically hear that, you know, firms are taking longer and longer to report their jobs numbers, and that is part of the problem. But as one of your former colleagues recently noted, I think you worked with Ernie Tedeschi at the Council of Economic Advisors. Actually, over time, BLS data has gotten better, not worse. Even despite the delays, the statistical processes have improved. So he pointed out to this chart where over the last literally 50 years, the accuracy has improved. Do you want to care to tell us a little more about that?
So it's absolutely true that actually data accuracy, even though you're hearing more about revisions now, accuracy has actually improved over time. And that's because of 2 things that are countervailing declining response rates. One is we're getting improved accuracy in reporting. So one source of error in economic data is that firms tell you something that turns out to be inaccurate. But we've been moving to electronic reporting in this country as increased digitization, and that's really driven like big declines in revisions and improvements in accuracy. The other is we've just gotten really good at statistical modeling. It's much better than it used to be. Modeling of births and deaths, which are hard to capture in an existing frame, it's gotten better. So the response rates have declined. That's definitely creating less precision sometimes in the data, but we have these countervailing forces, and those are dominating.
Yeah, I think any statistician knows that revisions and data cleanup come with the territory. There's nothing unusual about, and statistical agencies are designed to report their preliminary numbers and then the second revisions and the final revisions. So this really, was no shock to any of us that were following the news. But it was the question at the heart of this controversy is about integrity. The integrity of the data was questioned. And I just think that it's important for people to understand some of these methodological issues without getting too much in the weeds, why revisions are important and, what are some of the hurdles that the statistical agencies are facing. But let me switch from controversy to substance. As a professor, what I'm worried about is what kind of economy my students are graduating in. We know that there are very significant scarring effects if you graduate in a recession. And those of us that have been reading the economic tea leaves, we've noticed that the labor market had been losing steam, at least for 2 years. Maybe not a recession, but it had been losing steam. What is your assessment of the data, of the trends, the kind of the prospects for our students as they're applying for jobs?
Sure. So all of the economic data right now points to a solid but cooling labor market. So in particular, what drew a lot of attention recently is that the pace of jobs gains has slowed fairly markedly. But unemployment, it does remain low. It did tick up last month, which is maybe it might be even more concerning than the decline in the pace of jobs gains, because it hasn't moved in some time. Wage growth, it does remain strong, which is also an indicator that things are fairly solid, but inflation is starting to move in the wrong direction. And as prices increase, that's going to eat into those wage gains. One thing that makes reading the current signals right now a little bit confusing is that changes to immigration policy are impacting the labor supply. So that net job gains number, that big headline number that gets a lot of press, that's influenced by supply as well as demand. So if you're pushing down on labor supply, you're going to start to get lower numbers. And I'd actually been trying to prepare, particularly the non-economists in the briefings that I'd been doing last couple months, to expect some lower numbers as those immigration changes came through, just because they'd be pushing down on labor supply. So that makes looking at the pace of jobs gains, it's hard to tell how much of that is supply versus demand. But it is that uptick in the unemployment rate, I think, which signals that we're probably seeing both declines in supply and in labor demand. So that is some sign of weakening there. In terms of for the market for young people, anyone looking for a job this year, I count myself now among you. I have also been watching this very closely. It's not an easy labor market to break into. Hiring is pretty anemic, and this does tend to impact younger workers in particular, because you're just trying to break into the labor market. So I'll give you all the same advice I'm giving myself. Use your networks, give yourself some patience, give yourself some grace. Don't compare yourself to the people who graduated 2 years ago. They graduated into a very different labor market than you are looking at right now. But don't worry, plenty of us graduated into recessions. I finished grad school right as they were putting planes in the Twin Towers. And so it was a challenging job market. It does work out in the end. So Just give yourself some extra time. Would be my advice.
Yes, and prospects for college graduates are always better. I think we need to worry about the rest of the economy. You know, folks who are on the lower end of the income distribution, those that are first fired, last hired, those are kind of the dynamics that we need to watch out for as firms are kind of standing by at the moment, in the moment of uncertainty, and not, you know, not engaging in mass layoffs. We are not quite seeing that yet, but they're also not really like hiring. You know, they definitely slow down the pace of hiring. So we originally planned a different talk. You had sent, you know, a more traditional lecture that will engage with the data and topics like how do we see tariffs in the data, or how do we see the impact of AI adoption of firms in the data. So I wanted just briefly to talk a little bit about that, and maybe the AI portion. You know, people are worried, and we keep hearing plenty about this AI Armageddon, that on the long run, you know, leave the short-term fluctuations in the labor market, but on the long run, we're going to be seeing a lot of AI taking jobs from young people. How do you see this issue?
So I got this question a lot when I was BLS Commissioner. People wanted to know what the data was saying about the impacts of AI on the labor market. So a lot of the speculation about the impacts of AI on labor markets is by technologists who are forecasting the future. I'm going to stick to my lane and tell you what the data actually say about what's happening now. So some of the best data we have is looking at how businesses are using AI to change their own business practices. And the reason that's maybe the most interesting data to start looking at is because if AI is really this transformative technology that is really going to transform labor markets, it's going to change business practices. And so looking at what businesses are doing will tell you about how broad and how quick this will be. So what the business adoption data says right now is that adoption rates are actually lower than you would think. So only about 10% of businesses are experimenting with using AI in their business practices. And I should clarify, I don't mean like their employees are using ChatGPT to write emails. We all do that. We don't need any surveys to tell us that we're doing that. We know we're doing it. This is about developing enterprise use cases that are really going to change the way businesses do business. And this is really only about 10% of firms. It tends to be the larger firms, so it's covering more of employers. But it's actually ticked down recently. So we're seeing a decline in the recent data in the rate of business adoption. And that might be, there's a new study out of MIT, which is showing that a lot of the experimentation that businesses are doing with AI is failing. So they test out some customer service application with AI, maybe their customers hate it, and so they pull it back. And that might be responsible for some of the downtick we're seeing in the more representative data about how firms are using AI. So that's what I'm watching the most closely to get a sense. There's also there's a new paper out of Stanford which looks at the labor market impacts on young people, which is finding maybe the first empirical evidence we've seen to date that there are impacts on young people from AI. In particular, they found some employment effects in software development and in customer service, which are obviously two occupations very exposed to AI. So they didn't find any effect for experienced people. Experienced people didn't seem to be suffering employment losses because of AI, but there is some, that's the first empirical evidence we've really seen of any labor market impacts yet. So
do not worry just yet. Speaking of AI and big data, I wanted to ask another question that is perhaps more of interest to economists, but bear with me. There's proliferation in privately sourced data. There's a proliferation in proprietary data. And often there is a suggestion that that can replace the traditional government data, you know, by virtue of just getting so much of it. You know, think of, mortgage reporting, credit card reporting, click data from social media, and somehow these big aggregators can really give us, faster, better insight into consumer behavior or markets. Tell me how you think about this private versus public data issue.
So there is now a ton of private sector data available, and it is a really nice complement to the official statistics, but it's no substitute. The private sector companies can't really replicate what the government agencies, the official statistical agencies can do, for a couple of reasons. One is just the sheer scale of what the statistical agencies do. The job survey, that's like 600,000 establishments. That would be a massive undertaking for a business to stand up. There's a lot of private sector price data out there that you can buy. It's super expensive, by the way. I have priced it. But it's all goods, and a lot of inflation right now is services. So it's really hard for private sector data to even cover the scope of what the statistical agencies do. They tend to specialize in a particular area. Another issue is the representativeness of the data. So if you are a data nerd, you will notice that there is an ADP employment report that comes out, annoyingly, if you're running BLS 2 days before the jobs release, which everybody talks about for 2 days before the official numbers come out. So this is a payroll company. They have firms. They have very precise data on employment at the firms that use them as a payroll company. But it tends to not move with the jobs data that BLS produces very closely for a couple of reasons. One is it's not necessarily representative. It's 20% of firms, and it's not necessarily a nationally representative picture of the economy. The other is sample churn. So firms can choose to stop using ADP as a payroll company. And if you've ever used, okay, maybe nobody in this, when you talk to people who use ADP data in research, it is actually an issue to try and create a time series of firms in that data because there is sample churn. So when you're looking at a time series, I realize this is getting very wonky, I apologize. But when you look at a time series, you can't really tell, like, is this economic movement real, or is it just like the change of firms that are in that data? So the signal isn't terribly great. When it's really good is times like the pandemic, when the downturn is so sharp that the signal to noise ratio is amazing, and you can use a lot of these timely statistics in a really useful way. But when the economic movement is more slow, that noise can really get in the way of extracting any signal from private sector data. I will also say some of the biggest defenders of public statistics are private sector providers, because they use the official data to benchmark their own statistics to figure out that representative piece. So there's actually some of the biggest advocates for the work of the statistical agencies. And if the official data goes away, that private sector data is actually going to be rendered less useful as well.
Look, since you mentioned it, I have to share an anecdote. You mentioned payroll companies. In the middle of the pandemic, obviously, we were watching labor markets here very closely. And a colleague of mine from Bard College, Kyle Moore, spotted a new data source. Well, we all saw the new data source that was coming out of Harvard. It was the Opportunity Insights. And it was kind of important because they were using this novel data, collecting payroll data, and they were trying to assess the employment situation in a faster, timelier manner. And you can totally appreciate the necessity of this, right? You want real time, markets were evolving so quickly that you want to get a good sense of what's happening. But what he spotted is that there were a number of states that actually were reporting recoveries in their job situation that was far out of step with the BLS data. And we're talking about July 2020, when the official government data was still double digits. They were reporting recovery that was payroll growth that was faster than the pre-pandemic numbers. And so we figured, hold on a second, it could be an artifact. This is a new thing. They're working it out. Let's just pay attention, see what's going on. And we kept tracking it for some time. And time and again, we found significant discrepancies in that data. And I mean, we were very open and we kind of, called them out on it. And, they took the tracker for a time and, worked with it. But the reason why this troubled us at the time is because it was presented, as the director of this project called it, the God's eye of data. That it is all-seeing, that it collects such vast amounts of data, that it is so much more useful for policymakers. And that was really the claim, that they wanted policymakers to make reopening decisions on the basis of this data. And the data was flawed. And we tried to understand how the data was collected, but because it was proprietary, they couldn't really disclose the full information. We couldn't really understand exactly what were the shifts that were driving these discrepancies. To their credit, they took it down, they tried to, clean it up. But even today, I just looked it up last night, the latest data that they are reporting is as of May this year, not BLS is reporting August. So this idea of timeliness and being able to use these mega data sources, I still think the jury is out on that, and we are very much still looking to the BLS as the trusted source for what's happening in the labor market. Okay, so let me just a few more questions, and then I'll open it to the floor. We talk about budget pressures, and we talk about the discontinuation of data or the disruption of data. We use time-use data here at the Levy Institute very often. As a commissioner, how did you navigate these funding crunches? And you mentioned something about the DOGE efforts that impacted the agency, but I want you to talk a little bit about institutional knowledge, how these funding challenges and these mass layoffs impact the actual daily work of the agency.
Okay, there's a lot of questions packed in there. So I'm going to break it up and talk about funding, the funding picture before DOGE, and then talk about DOGE. So when I arrived at BLS, I expected to find that one of my major challenges was going to be addressing this declining response rate issue, modernizing some of the response methods, continuing some of the work that I had done at Census. And then I looked at the books, the financial books, and I was like, oh, actually, funding is going to be in a more immediate crisis. As I said in my remarks, in the years before I got to the agency, the budget had declined 18% in real terms over the previous 15 years. And kind of like if you go on a diet, and like the first year that you cut down calories and you look a little better, and the next year you cut down a little more and you look a little better. 15 years, you're starting to digest muscle and organs. And that was essentially the situation. So I was like, I worry that the fiscal sustainability of some of these major programs, it's on an unsustainable path, and I need to turn that around. That may need to be my first job. And it turned out I didn't even have any time. Within a couple of months of my arrival, the field staff came to me and they were like, okay, the president's budget's just passed, we just got our allocation, we've run the numbers, we're gonna have to cut the sample for the current population survey by 5,000. I realize to those of you who are not data nerds, that doesn't sound very dire, but it is, actually. The current population survey, when I was at the White House trying to figure out, was the labor market recovery stalling out? This was one of the key pieces of information that I was using. This is one of the most important pieces of information we have about the labor market. And it's not a big sample relative to the size of the US population. It's only 60,000 individuals, and it hasn't grown over time. So we worry about declining response rates. Cutting your sample by 5,000 is like imposing an additional response cut on yourself, and it's gonna impact the quality of the data. So it was very bad news. And what did I do about it? I started talking about it. So I announced the sample cut at a statistical meeting. I thought I would actually have to work hard to explain the importance of this to the American public. But instead, one meeting, there was a Bloomberg reporter in the audience. He wrote an article right away. That got picked up everywhere. Lots of financial journalists, turns out, understood immediately the implications of this. Because it wasn't just the 5,000. One thing I couldn't say publicly, because I want to, boring budgetary rules, is that it was probably going to be the beginning of sample cuts because of that trajectory problem. So it was just like every year it would get worse. So we got a lot of attention to the issue. It helped, I think, educate people about the funding situation for a lot of this data. And we actually did get an additional $6 million to avoid the sample cut, which is exactly the amount we needed. A partial victory. I was hoping that the trajectory of this funding for the survey would also change. Instead, we got this one-time bailout. So it's probably just kicked the can down the road because they right now look to be flat funded again. But it did help. I think, it did get $6 million for the survey. We still have the full sample in the field. So that was good news there. The second part of your question.
Institutional knowledge.
Oh, so, okay, that's the pre-Doge situation. So, as I think I've made clear, the funding, the staffing situation at BLS was not great when I arrived. And when Doge rolled into town, one of the first things they did was they sent an email to the entire federal government basically saying, please quit your government job and get a more productive job in the private sector. And if you don't, you might get fired. So obviously a pretty threatening email. The first time they rolled out this voluntary buyout, a lot of people didn't think it was legal. So the first rollout, we lost 4% of the staff, which was bad, but survivable. Then they rolled it out again, and there was a week in April where we lost 11% of the staff. And it was so fast. We got a list of hundreds of people on like Monday, and on Friday, they were gone. And we didn't know who they were until we got that list. We were scrambling, trying to figure out operationally how we were going to get through even the next week. There was an employment situation week where like every release had new people working on it in critical roles. I think I held my breath for the entire week, praying that nothing terrible was going to happen. But it's a real testament to the people who stayed behind and who filled in for the work of their colleagues that I'm sure all of you just experienced the world as normal. Everything just rolled out as usual. But it was a real trapeze act. And by the time I was fired, we were down 20% between the DRP and just attrition. And, operationally, we were just constantly working with managers, take down anything you think we don't need, postpone anything you think we can postpone. We are in survival mode until we can come back from this. So, I am extremely proud that we managed it this well and got this far with so many fewer people, but it was a real challenge and people worked really hard. I did think when Doge started to empty out, we had enough human capital left in the agency that we could come back. A lot of the more experienced people who were too young to retire, people my age, they had stuck around. And if we could hire again, we could train up new people and we could restore. We could build back. I'm obviously worried about that situation now.
Yes, thank you. To us economists, statisticians at the BLS are as vital as career scientists are in the CDC and the FDA. So before I open it to the floor, I want to ask one final question. We, as I said, at the Levy Economics Institute, are very heavily dependent on government data. What can we, think tanks, do beyond our contributions to methodology and research to help, support these government statistical agencies?
So economic data needs advocates. I think part of how we got here is we've taken a lot of this for granted. We didn't think anybody needed to defend that we needed an unemployment rate or that we needed jobs numbers or inflation data. Like, it's been part of the infrastructure of our country for so long. But if the agencies alone are the only people who are going to defend the spending on economic data, it's not going to be a good outcome. So economic think tanks are really well placed to make the argument for why this data is necessary and why it's worth funding. So when I was trying to figure out how I could turn around the funding situation, I started talking to people in the appropriations process about, like, why is BLS really struggling to get money for economic data? And one of them was an official at the Office of Management Budget. He said something to me, like, it was a really stark question. He asked me, why on earth would I give more money for greater statistical precision in the unemployment rate when I can use that money to feed hungry children? And it's a really stark question, but it tells you, like, what these people are weighing competing needs. And the answer to this question is that economic data actually, it does help feed hungry children. It does this in an indirect way that you have to outline for people. Economic data is part of the infrastructure for reducing the probability of recessions, for keeping prices low. A booming economy gives people good jobs to support their families. Lower prices make it easier to buy food to feed your kids. And economic data is really cheap. It's a really small investment to make in a better economy that makes lives better for all of us. And it's worth paying for. But, economic policy shops are well placed to make that argument to policymakers, and I think the argument has to be made.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We're going to switch gears, and now we're going to take some questions from the floor. Erika is very eager to engage with our students from her alma mater, so we will prioritize those questions. There are 2 microphones that will be coming up and down the aisles, so the floor is yours.
Hi, excuse me. Do you think the attack on the independence of statistics is going to continue into an attack on the teaching of economics as a science or as an art or as theory?
That's a hard question for me to predict in any reliable way, I think. We're 7 months into an administration that has had a lot of surprises. And I really don't want to speculate on what the plan is or what the intentions of the administration are. I'm sorry, that's maybe a non-answer to your question, but I wouldn't have predicted the last 7 months, I think, is the short answer. I hesitate to forecast any future outcomes.
Hello. And first, I just want to say thank you for your work and the work the BLS does. My question is about, you said that the employees of the BLS would sound the alarm if there was ever a question of the data integrity of the numbers they're putting out. And you've discussed some of the issues with other sources of data that economists and researchers could use. So I guess my question is, what is the next best hope for jobs data, for that sort of information, if the alarm is sounded and we do need to look to an alternative? Where would you recommend people look?
So the best hope is that interference stops with firing me. That is my best and my dearest hope, to be honest. If they continue to go down this path of interfering with economic data, it's really instructive to look at what happened in the other countries where this did happen. So in Argentina, for example, a lot of private sector vendors stood up operations to try and replicate some of the statistics that were missing. The Argentinian government went after them with lawsuits and with fines. Private sector actors are not immune from political interference, just like the public sector. I do think they've successfully won those lawsuits. I'd have to double check, but since my firing, there have been a lot of podcasts. I will say I did not spend much time, I probably should have, before I accepted the nomination for this job, looking at what happened to the people in Greece and Argentina and Turkey where this happened and what happened to them afterwards. But a lot of them are doing podcasts right now. In particular, listening to, my Greek is terrible, but the Greek statistician, he's done a number of really good podcasts where he talked about like what happened to the economy, what happened to him personally. It's well worth hearing. I won't try to repeat his story here. I'll just recommend that you look it up.
Hi, thank you so much again for being here. It's an honor. My question is more of a journalist, neither economic. Going back to the Friday, August 1st, after the debrief at 2 p.m. and after you receiving those emails in the car, did you have a conversation with people in White House or directly with a current president about why? Because it seems more of a political statement, neither a desire to make government work more efficient.
I think the question you're asking is, did I have any conversations with the White House about my firing? And the answer is no.
With Donald Trump
got the email.
particularly? No. Conversation with current president about that decision.
The email I read you was the only communication that I had.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a freshman at Bard, and I'd like to study economics. And in several years from now, I would hopefully like to get a job. So I'm wondering, what is the process of advocating for the future of economic data in this country? How do you go about trying to fix this problem?
So first, excellent choice in major. I actually do recommend economics as a career. Disappointingly, none of my nieces and nephews chose to go into economics. I'm trying not to take it personally. But it is a very, very cool field. And there are, in terms of your desire to get a job, it's still one of the few PhDs with a pretty strong job market. Because there's actually a lot of non-academic demand for economists. So government obviously is a big employer, but the private sector hires a ton of economists. Until recently, tech firms were a big employer of economists. And then of course there's academia. So highly recommend and validate your choice here. In terms of advocating for economic data, we really need friends on the Hill. We need friends in the administration. Economic data needs more powerful friends than it has. The mechanisms for that are many and myriad. It's not all on your shoulders.
Thank you.
I also want to say thank you. This was really incredible. And thanks, Kyle, for letting us come to this instead of go to class. My question is kind of more general. I'm a senior starting my senior project this fall, and I think a lot of us are kind of grappling with how to start working with data for our senior projects. And I guess my question is, where should you start? Like, where do you start when you're working with economic data? Like, is there a good place to jump off from? Is there a certain statistic that you think is a great place to start in terms of understanding the importance of economic data?
So it really depends on the question that you're looking into for your senior project. So one of my unofficial duties when I was at the White House was I was basically the data concierge. So we would have some crisis happening somewhere or some policy brief that we needed to prepare for somebody. And economists tend to specialize in very narrow bands and they know some data, they don't necessarily know the menu of data that's available. But being at the White House means getting out of your comfort zone a lot. And so basically, people were constantly showing up at my door being like, I need the best data on wages in the cities. Like, which of these available options is the best one? And so basically just figuring out what topic you want to start with is the place to start. And then look at the best available data to answer the question that you're really interested in answering. Fortunately, in the US, we are still blessed with a ton of great data. So one of the biggest advocates for data, economic data, all kinds of data, are people who work in policy and journalists, because they're always telling stories and they need data to tell those stories. That'd be my advice.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your story and your experience. I'm taking an ecological economics class, so I was very intrigued by your entire talk. You've mentioned that messing with economics is like messing with traffic lights, but what happens when the public starts ignoring those lights altogether? And the second question is, what is one statistical blind spot you think AI could illuminate if adoption becomes widespread and equitable?
So we are not yet at a point where people who use economic data are ignoring the signals. I'd say there's an inverse relationship between people's, like how much they actually use the data themselves as part of their job, or positive relationship. There's a relationship. Basically, the people who use this data to make decisions, people in financial communities, investors, business economists are some of the best economic, like honestly, like I'm not paying some of the business economists on social media to post some of the things that they do, like saying that BLS is amazing. They do that for free. The people who use this data are huge advocates for it. A lot of the skepticism you hear are from people who aren't actually using data. They're just sort of consumers of the news. And, you know, there's, I'd say, a fair bit of cynicism in our national culture, particularly at the moment. And so people will say, well, you know, I'm sure that inflation rate isn't real or something like that. But if you're actually investing, I mean, you're watching that inflation data so closely. So the second part of your question, do you still have the mic? I forgot it. AI. But specifically, what about AI?
I was going to ask, what is one statistical blind spot you think that AI could illuminate in economics, and if adoption becomes widespread and equitable?
Statistical blind spot AI could illuminate. I mean, that's a tough question. I don't know that I have a ready response to it. I will say that as an agency head, I was definitely one of those businesses that was trying to figure out how we could productively use AI to improve data, and trying to come up with business use cases that would work. I obviously got fired before I got far down this path, but one thing I was talking about was like, can we use AI to read in free-form data from firms and create structured data from it and basically lower response burden for firms reporting data to government agencies? So like that was a potential use. So my focus was, can we have AI make it easier for people to provide data to the government so we could tabulate data? That was my focus at the time. I saw one more.
Hello. Thank you for being here today. My question relates to, let me see if I can formulate this in the correct way that makes sense, but my question relates to how DEI initiatives that the Trump administration labeled has impacted the labor market. I don't know if you'll have an answer to this because your tenure with the administration ended so abruptly, but I was just wondering if you knew the demographics of people who were impacted by the very sudden, I guess, ending of DEI initiatives and programs, I guess.
So there was an early executive order basically changing the types of gender questions you could ask. So, sort of a specific example of this. And we had to go through all of our surveys and make sure that we only had binary genders that we were asking. It didn't actually impact BLS because economic data, we really were only asking those two genders, but there were efforts in other agencies to be more expansive, and they had to shut those down.
Thank you.
Hi, I just want to thank you so much for everything that you've done. And I'm a student joint majoring in political science and economics. And so my question to you is actually more about your time as a White House advisor. And I was wondering, how much does the administration actually listen to the economists and the expert opinions that they are surrounded by?
So I'm going to speak generically. It's a real challenge as an economic think tank working in a place like the White House to figure out a way to influence the policy process. Because, so there's an expression that economists use about our role here, which is we're the skunk at the garden party. Which is we're usually the people being actually, that's a terrible idea. If you do that too forcefully, and then you will not be invited in the room where you can have influence. And so it's a balancing act. If you want to have economic input into the policy process, you need to figure out a way to engage, even when sometimes you think they, maybe it's not economically the best idea. So it's a challenge, I'd say. I was very fortunate in that I mostly worked on data, and the one thing that people in the White House really did want to know was it was a recession happening. So I got a pretty broad, I've got very good audience for most of the stuff I was doing. But working in the policy process was a bit more of a dance.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for being here first and for the talk you've given. I'm Vishal. I'm a junior, also studying econ at Bard. Quick question. So in the time you've been a data nerd, as you say, and over the time you've also worked as the BLS Commissioner that ended quite recently, is there a project or perhaps a data set that was the most meaningful to you, or you thought was the most impactful to your life, or perhaps you think perhaps most impactful to the people you shared it with?
You are asking me to choose among my dear children? Some people from BLS might be watching this. I love all of the data programs equally. I have no favorites. Seriously, ask me later. There's one hand.
So I'm a researcher who works with the CPI data very directly on a regular basis, and there's been reports that from February of 2022 till this most recent August, there's been a threefold increase in the amount of imputed price data being used in the inflation numbers. I was wondering if you could speak more to the specific subsets of that index that are using imputed data, the direction of the bias that might incorporate, and maybe some of the downstream effects of increasing use of imputed data in price indexes.
So I did not plant him, but he has given me an excellent opportunity to clear up something that was a constant source of confusion when I was at the tail end of my time at the Bureau. So the chart you are referencing is not imputation rates. It is the imputation type. And a lot of people looked at this chart and thought, oh, look, I see this increase in different source imputation methods. And so it must be the case that, especially because I knew Doge had come into town and we were shorthanded, it must be the case that imputation rates have gone up. So the fact is that CPI, I think they're about to change this actually, does not publish imputation rates. So I think it was being discussed my last few weeks there that they were going to change that so they could make this clearer. I'm going to characterize, so loosely, what the impacts of Doge on CPI data collection were. I obviously don't have imputation rates to give you, but staffing for CPI data collection declined 20% pretty rapidly in the spring. And sometimes that meant in some small markets, we lost all the data collectors and they had to be dropped. We couldn't hire. We were in a hiring freeze, still in a hiring freeze. So it's not like we could just find somebody else. And you couldn't like send, we were short-staffed. You couldn't send people to these smaller markets. But actually the bigger impact on the overall quality of the statistics was the percentage reduction we had in larger areas, which wasn't as easily known. The BLS staff were extremely innovative. They used a lot of the flexing they had done during the pandemic to minimize the staffing impact on the price indices. Mostly by reducing collection of data where there's a very small weight in the basket or where we had lots of duplicates. So like, it was like maybe 11 different kinds of dress pants. We collect a lot of price data in the CPI, like maybe 10's fine. Like, so, trying to be smart about where they were cutting data collection so that would have less impact on the aggregate data that is used particularly by the Fed to manage monetary policy. So because we were still recovering from the pandemic and from data collection, Doge set us back like 6 months to a year. Didn't set us back to 22 levels of resources in the field, but it did set back a lot of the recovery that they had. So they need to hire. We were working on a hiring waiver when I left. Hopefully it was successful.
We'll take one more question.
So you made a comment about being advised that to get a productive job in the private sector, but if the BLS closed down, I'm not sure what any of the economists I know in the private sector would actually do, basically, because all they do is interpret the data that you produce, or produced, I should say. I'm active in NABE, who's a strong supporter of your case and cause. And I had a question which, subsequent to obviously getting summarily fired, have you experienced any further intimidation or anything of that kind?
No, none. Yeah.
That was it.
And we hope it stays that way. And I understand that the alumni office has a little something for you, but I just, on behalf of our community, I wanted to thank you for your public service and for this memorable conversation.